Hi everyone, today we talk to a long-time China military observer. We start with the Zhuhai Show. How was it at the beginning? How is it now? How it has evolved over the years. Then we talk about, is Taiwan ready for a war? Is it ready to fight? Is it well prepared? And most of all, how might the invasion look like? Then the 7 wars that China might fight. Taiwan being the first step and Japan the next. And at the end, the nuclear threat both to the region and the world. Welcome to the show.
So Taiwan is not the end of Chinese Communist Party ambitions. It is the beginning, and the goal is global hegemony. Yes, the unwritten story of probably the last decade has been the very active shadow boxing war between the People's Liberation Army and the forces of the United States. China is truly devoting the resources necessary to build a military, not just to dominate Asia, but eventually to dominate the world. Their goal is global hegemony.
Hi everyone, today we have a new guest. It's Rick Fisher, a well-known military and security analyst. We will discuss how it is some topics with regards to Asia. Rick, hello, welcome to the show.
Richard, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. Yes, I've been analyzing the Asian military balance for nearly 40 years. I thought I would graduate from college and become the world's expert on the Soviet Navy. That was back in 1981. But history changed quickly, and luckily, I managed to get some jobs studying Asian politics and military affairs, and that's where I've remained. Soviet Navy disappeared for a little bit. Now it's back in business, but it's nowhere near what it was during the Cold War. But yes, I've been writing about Chinese military modernization pretty regularly since the mid 1990s. I've been able to visit 5 of China's 14 Zhuhai air shows, their major biannual military exhibition. They stopped giving me visas after 2004. The reasons were never explained, but for people in my category, those reasons are never explained by the Chinese government. So I've continued. I've traveled to dozens of other military exhibitions where the Chinese display their wares. I ask them questions. Sometimes I get answers, and I write articles about them.
Great, exactly. That's what I wanted to start with. If you could maybe walk us through the how was the show in the beginning and how it's changed recently. I know you published about it. So please show us a little bit how are the changes and where is it all going? What's the PLA showing and proving to us during this show?
The first show was a real adventure. It was the first time that the Zhuhai city government, in essence, was leading the show, organized it with major Chinese aerospace industries, uh, and the People's Liberation Army kind of had a side role. Yes, behind the scenes, it was more or less in charge, but it really didn't want to put that role out front and center. But it was a kind of freewheeling show. The Chinese at the booths were just as curious about the foreigners who were attending as the foreigners were of this new Chinese air show. I mean, here, China had just recently emerged from the just amazing uh, limited existence, limited life of the Mao era, and was now trying to put on a show for the rest of the world. It was quite a spectacle, and what was really great about it is that you could have real conversations. You could point to a Soviet helmet-mounted sight that are used to be used in Poland's MiG-29s, and talk about, oh yeah, the Russians sold that to us. Now we're co-producing it. Here's how we made it better. It was great for a someone who was at the time writing for aviation magazines, Jane's Defense Weekly. All of this was great material, and the five Zhuhai shows I was able to attend, all yielded what was for me major stories, including the last show when I exposed that China was illegally taking an American Boeing 737 and modifying that aircraft to support long-range cruise missile testing. The Shan Aircraft Corporation that had put the aircraft on display in a video mistakenly, I assume, was pointed out by a colleague. I wrote it up as a story. I'm sure it caused a lot of heartburn for Boeing and the American government at the time, but it was papered over, ignored. China now deploys the cruise missiles against Taiwan, against American military bases in Asia. But at least I was able to see this evidence of Chinese skullduggery and write about it. That was the beauty of the Zhuhai Show in the beginning. But then after about 2006, they stopped answering questions. Journalists simply could not walk up to people at the booths and the displays and ask the kind of detailed questions that we could during previous shows. They were instructed to not talk to us. And that's pretty much the way it's been since about the mid 2000s. But the show has taken on a new role. By 2012, China turned the show into an air, land forces, and naval forces show. So not only did you get what was new, what they wanted to advertise in the aerospace industry, you were getting full view of what the ground force developers and producers were selling, as well as what the naval producers were selling as well. So in a sense, the show became much more valuable to the journalist or intelligence oriented observer, but it had also evolved into a kind of coercive exercise. China has put all of these weapons on display, not to really explain them. Yes, the state media occasionally produces articles on these weapons, but by and large, foreigners are not allowed to ask nitty gritty details. The show has become a way of projecting to the world, and especially to the Americans, that China is becoming expert in every phase, in every dimension of military production. And this is only going to get bigger and larger because whereas the United States may have one or two companies developing and building precision guided weapons, China has four or five. And this kind of repetition just pervades the military sector. China is truly devoting the resources necessary to build a military, not just to dominate Asia, but eventually to dominate the world. Their goal is global hegemony, and we must never forget that.
Yeah. So basically, it became from as you said, a way to communicate with the Chinese, just a one way road when they just exhibited and showed off and projected their power, kind of like that kind of thing. So there was no discussion. They probably started to collect intelligence or knowledge, maybe from the other side. Yes, maybe asking more questions and answering questions.
Oh yes, yes. I mean, it's funny. And about a decade ago, you were able to find on the Chinese internet a series of pictures of the Zhuhai organizing officials receiving the displays from the foreign companies. Okay, so you have all these boxes that are lined up, and only Chinese are unloading them and bringing them to the display area. So as soon as these boxes hit the tarmac, it is Chinese, probably intelligence officials that are handling them and putting them together. I mean, it's pretty insidious. I mean, I was told about almost 20 years ago that for the Singapore Air Show, it used to be that a Singapore company was in charge of putting together the displays across the show floor. Uh, 2 shows later, it was disclosed to me by friends that this job had been subcontracted to a Chinese company. So, how many arms shows around the world are being subcontracted to Chinese companies that are now very expert in putting on almost anybody's arms exhibit? But clearly, this kind of company or these companies are staffed for offensive action.
So if people like you were kind of disinvited, or so who's attending them? Like who's going to those shows nowadays? How do they
Well,
choose the journalists?
well, the last show was extremely difficult. I'm not sure that there were any foreign journalists there simply because of the COVID China virus restrictions that are in place. You had to spend a week or 10 days in a hotel, sitting there doing nothing, paying for the room, paying for all your meals, paying for whatever medical rigmarole you had to go through. And most journalists don't have deep pockets like that. So I would be surprised if there were any really foreign journalists. So the only really foreigners that were there were probably uh, Air Force military attaches from the embassies in Beijing, uh,
Okay.
and that's probably it.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. That's a great update. I wanted to ask you about an article you wrote. You described in an article in June how the Taiwan's President Tsai visited during the Dragon Boat Festival the 66th Marine Brigade, and without warning, as you write, she paused to pick up and get the feel of a Taiwan-designed and made Kestrel shoulder-fired infantry rocket. And you said that was a sign for Taiwanese, supposedly, that if she can do it, then everybody should be able to defend the country, to encourage the society. So my question is, how is Taiwan's defense doing? Is there an example from the top? Or how do you think that the government failed? Like the recent elections just last weekend, they actually showed that DPP failed, didn't really communicate their policies, and failed, as many Taiwanese view their performance. So what do you think? How does it look like in Taiwan with regards to defense?
Well, there are good aspects and sad aspects to Taiwan's ability to prepare to both deter and even defeat an invasion from the People's Liberation Army. Uh, on the good side of the ledger, you have a longstanding and an increased commitment by Taiwan to develop all manner of missiles, 1,000-kilometer range land attack missiles to artillery rockets, guided artillery rockets, and to put into production the kinds of very necessary shoulder fired anti tank rockets that President Tsai so boldly picked up and symbolized defiance to China and encouraged her countrymen to begin to consider how they can defend Taiwan as well. But unfortunately, Taiwan does not have a well developed reserve or even a militia component. And this is where politics in Taiwan becomes dicey. Um, Sending your sons away to the army to be in the draft for a year or more is very unpopular politically. Okay, uh, so therefore, Taiwanese politicians, leaders, are reluctant, I'd say very reluctant to ask their people to do even more, to ask average people to join, form local militia units, make available to them simple training on videos, and then distribute weapons, let's say, to the 1,500 police stations that are in Taiwan so that they can be readily available when the PLA invades. Because the PLA is going to be invading from every direction. They have over 1,000 transport helicopters to conduct airborne assaults. Uh, they're going to mobilize some proportion of the over 100,000 barges and ferries, civilian quote unquote barges and ferries to transport troops and materiel to Taiwan. Um, the PLA may have to conduct not just one D-Day, but 3 or 4 D-Days in order to uh, gain a foothold in Taiwan sufficient to force the government in Taipei to surrender. Today, in my opinion, they do have the depth to conduct 2, 3, maybe even more D-Day size invasions. That's 100,000 troops. And then on top of that, you add the 3,000 Boeing and Airbus airliners that uh, can all, if they capture enough airfields, can also be just flying in troops and materiel constantly. So the need for a militia, the need for a Ukraine style national mobilization. Everybody who can fight has to learn how to fire a gun, preferably learn how to fire a shoulder fired rocket, know how to set up a mine to take out a tank, whatnot. People, hundreds of thousands of citizens, should all have these skills and should all have the ability to access their weapons. But this is not the case in Taiwan. And for
Yes.
many observers, many analysts, this is very troubling.
Yes, Wendell Minnick, who was a guest on this show, he said everybody here just wants his bubble tea and that's it. And then there is no discussion about anything else. And that's what the elections actually proved. The government isn't talking about difficult issues because people don't want to hear them. So actually, it bodes quite bad for Taiwan.
Well, I would add a caveat to that, Richard.
Yes.
The local elections are not always indicative of national desires and national trends. The Democratic Progressive Party still remains very popular, and especially popular with young people because they are the ones that are trusted to oppose China, to oppose Chinese conquest of Taiwan, and to continue to support freedom on Taiwan. The Kuomintang certainly has factions and prominent leaders that are committed to the defense of Taiwan as a free nation, but it also has factions that believe that they can have a kind of peace in our time with China, which is simply an illusion.
Thank you. So the next topic I wanted to ask you, you wrote in another article, you described the blockade that was imposed on Taiwan, let's say blockade, after Nancy Pelosi's visit, and you described how the PLA shot up to 4 missiles that flew over Taiwan, apparently high enough to exceed the reach of existing Taiwan missile interceptors. And you also wrote that few of those few other missiles were shot into Japanese maritime area. So it means that the PLA targeted not only Taiwan but also Japan. Uh, I think we can't discuss one without the other. Taiwan is just the first step, and Japan, Senkaku Islands, or would it be the Okinawa, would be just the second step, briefly, short after Taiwan. So could you maybe elaborate on that? Because most people, they just don't see both together. But I think it's one and the same issue. Taiwan is just the first chapter, and then Japan would follow.
Indeed. I would say about 15 years ago, in the midst of China becoming very, very adept at censoring its internet, allowed the widespread publication of an article to had the title to the effect the seven or eight wars that China must fight. And of course, the first one was against Taiwan. The second war was going to be to secure the South China Sea. The third or fourth war was going to be to take the Ryukyu Island chain, now that is now Japanese territory. Then to conquer the disputed territories with India, and finally, at the end, win the war with Russia to take back the territories that Russia took from China hundreds of years ago. So I've never regarded, from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party or the PLA, they do not view the Taiwan battle as the end of their ambitions. The battle for Taiwan represents the beginning of their global hegemonic ambition.
Yeah, totally.
Attacking the Japanese Sakishimas, yes, of course. Taking the Senkakus, yes. Eventually taking Okinawa, of course. All of this will happen. But at the same time, China will be developing Taiwan into a massive military base for
Yes.
nuclear ballistic missiles, nuclear ballistic missile submarines, bombers, power projection fleets, aircraft carriers. All of this will be going to Taiwan, and Taiwan's youth will be drafted to fight the foreign wars that China believes it must win on the road to hegemony. And right now, or for the past, I'd say almost 12 to 15 years, China has been trying to revive the Falklands conflict between Argentina and Britain. They've been trying very hard to rearm Argentina so that at least Argentina has a better chance of intimidating, coercing Britain into giving up those islands. Now, this is a global conflict. The United States now requires that those islands remain in British hands, which gives the Chinese a gift that they can continue to exploit and rally not just anger against the United States and Argentina, but all over Latin America. But we can't allow the Falklands to fall to Argentine sovereignty because Argentina will give those islands to China immediately. And those islands may be required to help defend the United States from new Chinese hypersonic glide vehicles that now travel over the South Pole and then travel north to attack targets in the United States. So Taiwan is not the end of Chinese Communist Party ambitions. It is the beginning, and the goal is global hegemony, control over the security and prosperity of all countries on Earth, and we should all be very alarmed with this.
Thank you for watching the show. Please leave a like or a comment. If you didn't like it, share it.